Hello friends, I Ajay Jha welcome you in this COP27 podcast series on behalf of PAIRVI, Center for Community Economics and Mosam. In this episode, we will discuss what's at the COP27 table and what's our expectations from this COP. As you know, this COP is going to begin in few days at Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt. And this COP is taking place in two significant backdrop. One is the Russia-Ukraine war, which is lingering on for more than 6 months, and it has imposed a fuel, finance, food crisis all over the world. And the impacts of this war alone is likely to send 250 million people into extreme poverty. So this war has severely affected the energy security all over the world, and many of the European and also developed countries are dusting off their thermal power plants and going back to secure supplies from oil and gas from many countries, including Norway, US, Middle East, North Africa, and some of the countries of the Asia. So that's one part of the backdrop. The second important and sort of climatically relevant backdrop is the scorching summer this year. And as you might know that many parts of the world, including Europe and Northern America, also in Asia, the summer was extremely hot. And it is considered to be second hottest summer in the history. And in India, we suffered 280 days of heat waves in this year. And if you compare with what was the number of heat waves days 10 years back, it was just 40 days of heat wave days. In Europe, the temperatures touched 40 degrees Celsius in UK for the first time, and UK sounded a red alert. The temperature touched 42 degrees Celsius in many parts of the Spain and Portugal, which killed more than 1,700 people, most of them elderly above 65 years who could not tolerate this extreme heat wave. Half of the Eurozone was under the danger of drought. And in Northern America, too, more than 70% of the people witnessed extreme heat waves, which they have sort of never experienced. In China also, it was a drought-like situation and heat waves. And because of drought-like situations, many of the countries could not sort of support their thermal power plants and nuclear power plants because of scarcity of water. Not only heat waves, but also we saw extreme floods this year in Nigeria, in South Africa, and in Pakistan. And it is noticeable that in Pakistan, floods mainly in two districts, Sindh and Baluchistan, where it was the severest. Sindh received 780% more than the average rainfall, and Baluchistan received more than 500% of the average rainfall which they generally receive. So what do you do with this kind of deviation and climate extremes? As a result, more than 1,700 people have already died in the Pakistan floods. More than 2 million became homeless, and more than 33 million people were affected. And the Pakistan government has estimated a damage of 40 billion US dollars. So I think the loss and damage should be the first thing on demand from the climate vulnerabilities countries, also from the civil society organizations part of view. And as you might remember, in last year in Glasgow, also climate vulnerable countries very strongly demanded a financial mechanism to address loss and damage. But that was rejected. What was accepted that the COP26 started a 2-year process to look into how financial mechanism can be created in the loss and damage. COP26 also promised to operationalize Santiago Network on loss and damage in 2023, which is this year. So we expect that there would be a lot of discussion on loss and damage, and Pakistan, as G77 chair, it has already shot a letter recently to the COP president, bringing loss and damage on the COP27 agenda. And it's ironical that even in the face of these climate extremes, loss and damage is not formally on the agenda of the COP27. This is also an African COP, and since there have been huge losses due to floods and also due to drought, Eastern Africa and Sahel region is witnessing 6 consecutive years of drought. And because of these reasons, we expect that African countries will also put a lot of pressure on the COP host to make loss and damage an important part of the negotiations rather than just having dialogues and going around in circles in Warsaw International Mechanism and SNLD, none of which address the financial dimensions of loss and damage. And I mean, it's extremely important if you look at the requirement of loss and damage. I mean, it is expected that even after adaptation, developing countries would need $116 to $435 billion by 2020 in terms of loss and damage. These will be the residual damage created by extreme climate events, which cannot be addressed by adaptation. They will require an amount of $290 to $580 billion every year from 2050. And if you look at the financial requirement or estimates at the end of this century, it goes up to something like from $1 trillion to $1.8 trillion by the end of the century. I mean, US has persistently rejected any dialogue or demand to create a financial mechanism to address loss and damage. And they have been saying that we should address loss and damage through existing mechanisms, which also addresses, they generally look at loss and damage as an issue of humanitarian aid, but that is grossly and awfully short of the requirement. I mean, the post-disaster requirements can be fulfilled to some extent by humanitarian aid. But then what do you do about slow onset events? I mean, there are many countries which are suffering from unimaginable losses. I mean, many island countries are losing their graveyards. States in the Pacific are losing their tuna products, which has a sort of contribution of more than 1/3 in their national economy. So how do you deal with that? And there needs to be a financial mechanism to address this kind of loss and damage. So we are hopeful and we are expecting that COP will take a meaningful decision on quickly creating an appropriate financial mechanism to address loss and damage. The second most important item for, so to say, people and civil society organizations is also for the countries is climate finance. And climate finance has always been high on the agenda and very relevant in the COP negotiations. And this is an old promise of 2009 in Copenhagen, which the developed countries have failed to deliver. The amount of $100 billion which they promised they will mobilize from 2020 onwards. But as you might remember, the last COP, the SCF report determined that the climate finance in 2019 was only $79 billion. This year, there is an OECD report which says that in 2020, climate finance reached up to only $83 billion. So it's $17 billion is still short of the promised amount. And the OECD report also tells us that the adaptation finance is only 1/3 of the part of the total climate finance and reaches only up to something like $28 billion. So the expectations of quickly reaching up to this $100 billion is failing significantly. And that creates a matter of distrust between developing and least developed countries and SIDS and on the one part and NX1 countries as they were earlier called or industrialized countries on the other. There's a discussion to happen on the new collective quantified goal, which will be sort of floor of climate finance beyond 2025. And we expect meaningful discussion on this, and we expect that if it determines an amount, that amount will not be a mythical figure pulled out of thin air, but it will be based on the experience of delivery of climate finance and the needs of the developing and smaller countries. And as you know, that UN reports already say us that the climate finance needs to be upped by almost 5x to 6x. That is 6 times more than what it is right now. So there's a huge climate finance gap that needs to be bridged, and that would be, I think, the most important factor to build trust between developing countries and developed countries so they participate meaningful in the negotiations. The third most important thing, is adaptation. And for developing countries and least developed countries and SIDS, adaptation is extremely critical, and they have been asking for more discussion and dialogue on adaptation and more adaptation support. But till now, we only have a global goal on adaptation. Article 7 of the Paris Agreement defines adaptation as enhancing adaptive capacity, strengthening resilience, and reducing vulnerability to climate change. But that's what it says. And beyond that, we haven't been able to move on defining adaptation with more clarity, defining what the process will be with more understanding, and how to mobilize finance for adaptation. These critical issues need to be addressed in the discussion which will take place on global goal on adaptation. You might remember that COP26 in Glasgow set up a 2-year dialogue on Glasgow Sharm el-Sheikh dialogue on global goal on adaptation, and we expect and demand significant progress on that. Also, equally important is adaptation finance, and you will remember that COP26 in Glasgow noted with deep regret that we are failing in climate finance, but at the same time, it also said that we'll try to double adaptation finance by 2025, trying to make it reach up to at least $40 billion by 2025. But here also there is a huge gap in finance, and if you look at the recent UNEP's adaptation gap report, which was brought out just 2 days back, it says that though 84% of the countries include adaptation in their NDCs, but most of them are still basically at the level of planning, and there is a huge financing gap in adaptation, and they estimate that developing countries would require something like $160 to $340 billion every year from 2030 onwards for adaptation, and from $315 to $565 billion every year by 2050. So we see that if you compare it with what has been promised in adaptation finance, which is $40 billion, that is hugely insignificant in the light of the adaptation finance requirement. So we definitely want COP to take note of this adaptation gap and come up with meaningful discussions and clear roadmap towards delivery of adaptation finance. So that will be high on the agenda. So besides these three issues of loss and damage, climate finance, and adaptation finance, we have seen that in this year, report after report from, say, IPCC to UNFCCC to UNEP to WMO have said that we are doing pitiably, woefully in meeting requirements of science as far as limiting the rise in temperature to 1.5 degrees is concerned. And in the light of that, last COP invited all the parties to enhance their NDCs by COP27, which is this COP. But it's very unfortunate that only 24 countries have enhanced their NDCs. And there are very few big countries. For example, Australia, Egypt, Brazil, India have enhanced their NDCs. But the rest of them are very small countries, and big economies have not responded to that call, which is very disappointing. The recent UNEP emission gap report says that even if all the conditional pledges are implemented perfectly, the rise in temperature by the end of the century will be at least 2.4 degrees Celsius, which is way above the both targets of the Paris Agreement, 1.5 degrees Celsius the Glasgow target or well below 2 degrees Celsius, which is the Paris Agreement target. They also say that at current policies, rather than reducing emissions are likely to increase by 10.6% by 2030. And I hope that all of you will remember that IPCC asks us to halve the global emissions by 2030 and reach net zero by 2050 if the 1.5 degrees goal has to be saved. And till now, we see that all the efforts have been hugely and disappointingly awful in meeting this demand. So we hope that COP takes notice of this, and the last COP set up a mitigation work program, which is to be finalized this year. And mitigation work program had a meeting in June in Bonn, where much progress could not be made, and there are still sort of a gap between the expectations of the developed countries and developing countries as far as defining the work of this work program, what should be the time period for this program, and how the process will move forward. So we expect that work program on mitigation will be finalized in this COP, and that will take into consideration the fervent demands of the scientists and reports after reports saying that the current efforts are hugely inadequate. Besides that, there's a global stock take already taking place, and we expect significant progress on that. As you know, global stock take is sort of review of the implementation of the Paris Agreement, and the objective of the global stock take is to guide further nationally determined contributions. And this process is likely to be wound up in 2023 next year, so as to be able to guide new sets of indices which will be produced in 2025 by all member countries. So we hope that there is a significant process in this global stock take, and it takes into consideration the needs of the science as well as the needs of the developing and least developed countries and vulnerable countries. Equally important is one more thing, which you might remember that there were more than 100 pledges and declarations adopted in Glasgow outside the process of COP. And reportedly, United Nations Secretary General has set up a committee to look into these pledges and convert them into concrete action points. But till now, the progress is not satisfactory, I would say. And as you might remember, these pledges included, importantly, a methane pledge, which is to reduce the methane emission by 30% by 2030. More than 100 countries committed to do that. You must be aware that methane is 86 times more powerful than carbon dioxide in a short-term period of 20 years as far as influencing climate change is concerned. Last year, we saw some progress, US and China coming together on methane reduction, but that action is now in the doldrums because of the geopolitical tensions between US and China. You would be aware. Though there has been some progress between US and EU during this year's Major Economies Forum, where a small fund of, say, 48 billion US dollar was created. And some more countries, and UNEP has committed to provide some sort of technical assistance also to countries who are in this pledge. Other major pledge was on the deforestation, where more than 150 countries decided to halt and reverse deforestation. By 2030, there was also a fund created for this purpose, which amounted to something like 12 billion US dollars. Though this pledge did not include India, China, and South Africa, but we hope that there is significant progress on this pledge also. I mean, you might be aware that Lula Inácio da Silva has again been elected as the president of Brazil, and that looks to be promising as far as ending deforestation in the Amazon area is concerned. So we would be also looking forward towards this. Then you might remember that many countries, at least 100 cities and corporations and countries, committed to end ICE engines, internal combustion engines, which are engines run by petrol or diesel, by 2035 to 40. Many countries also committed to end ICE trucks and buses, but we don't see much progress in this. And a recent report quotes that only 18 countries have committed to end ICE engines during a period of 2030 to 25. 11 countries have committed to zero emission buses, and only 9 countries have committed to end ICE trucks. So we would be interested to see further progress on this pledge also. We also heard a lot about cities and regions greening themselves in the last COP, and more than 1,000 cities and regions also committed to zero emissions or net emissions in a campaign called Race to Zero. But the recent Race to Zero report says that only 1/3 of the countries or regions or cities that are part of the campaign are reporting progress on that. The data is highly insufficient and sketchy. So we would also expect good progress on that, and would expect that the process comes on track soon to help the overall climate ambitions of the countries. Last but not the least was a pledge to end coal domestically by 2022. And 46 countries decided to end coal domestically, which included UK, Canada, Poland, and Vietnam, Indonesia, countries like that. But as I said earlier, the progress has been marred due to energy security crisis created by Russia, Ukraine. Many of the European countries are also dusting off their old thermal power plants and extending lives of already running thermal power plants. They are also securing supplies of oil and gas from many countries, including Norway, US, Middle East, Northern Africa, and also some of the countries from Asia. So these countries have been saying that this is only a short-term process. We saw that G7 also exempted gas supplies from this pledge. So we understand that there is setback to ending coal domestically, as well as ending international support to fossil fuel projects abroad. But we expect that this will be a very short-term measure, and the countries would not linger their coal addiction. These are some of the important things that we would like to be converted into concrete commitments and actions in this COP. So I would end here and see you in the next episode. Thank you so much for listening.